All right. I'm going to give this one another try. Democracy for Realists, Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government by Christopher Achen and Larry Bartels. Chapter 2, The Elusive Mandate, Elections and the Mirage of Popular Control. Quote, a good deal of traditional democratic theory leads us to expect more from national elections than they can possibly provide. We expect elections to reveal the will or the preferences of a majority on a set of issues. This is one thing elections rarely do, except in an almost trivial fashion. End quote. Robert A. Dahl, A Preface to Democratic Theory, 1956. Robert Dahl began A Preface to Democratic Theory by acknowledging that, quote, there is no democratic theory, there are only democratic theories, end quote. Nevertheless, he noted that running through the whole history of democratic theories is the identification of democracy with political equality, popular sovereignty, and rule by majorities, a notion of populistic democracy. He associated with such diverse thinkers as Aristotle, Locke, Rousseau, Jefferson, de Tocqueville, and Lincoln. Dahl's notion of populistic democracy corresponds closely with what we have called the folk theory of democracy. In particular, its emphasis on popular sovereignty requires that whenever policy choices are perceived to exist, the alternative selected and enforced as governmental policy is the alternative most preferred by the members of the relevant political community. But how might popular sovereignty in this sense actually come about? Theorists in this tradition, and practitioners alike, have focused on two primary mechanisms, electoral competition and direct democracy, in the form of popular initiatives or referenda. We consider these two mechanisms in this and the following chapter, respectively. Excuse me. As the Gilded Age of the late 19th century came to an end, aristocratic English observer James Bryce portrayed Americans marching with steady steps toward a new stage in the evolution of government by public opinion, in which the will of the people acts directly and constantly upon its executive and legislative agents. Populism as a political movement crested in the United States in the 1890s, but the progressive era that followed was also characterized by high enthusiasm for popular democracy as a broad political ideal. Historian Charles Beard, who could be clear-eyed and even cynical about the political motives of the founders, nevertheless expressed the conviction that, quote, every branch of the law that has been recast under the influence of popular will has been touched with enlightenment and humanity. End quote. He argued that the era's new political institutions, including the initiative, referendum, and recall, would surely produce still better government in the future through greater democratization. In the same spirit, John Dewey insisted that it was no mystic faith, but a well-attested conclusion from historic facts, that government can serve the people only when, quote, the community itself shares in selecting its governors and determining their policies, end quote. Even the famously acerbic journalist and political observer H.L. Mencken expressed his skepticism about democracy in colorfully populist terms, defining it as, quote, the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard, end quote. By the middle of the 20th century, the populist ideal was firmly established in both American political culture and scholarly understanding of democracy. Political thinkers who resisted the identification of democracy with political equality, popular sovereignty, and rule by majorities felt compelled to explain why. As we noted in the previous chapter, Joseph Schumpeter prefaced his own theory of democracy with a scathing critique of the unrealism of a classical doctrine in which democracy, quote, realizes the common good by making the people itself decide issues through the election of individuals who are to assemble in order to carry out its will, end quote. Dahl was less dismissive of populistic democracy, but emphasized the importance of alternative Madisonian and polyarchal conceptions. Even William Riker, who would later castigate populism as a totalitarian sleight of hand used to justify coercion in the name of temporary or spurious majorities, wrote in a mid-century American government textbook that, quote, truly responsible government is only possible when elections are so conducted that a choice of men is a decision on policy, end quote. He added that plebiscites in the Soviet Union, quote, are a facade because the structure of government does not permit elections to influence policy making, end quote. Ironically, the decades in which Schumpeter and the early Dahl and Riker wrote also gave rise to two major intellectual challenges to the folk theory. One of these was a logical challenge stemming from the theoretical work of economists studying collective choice. Duncan Black, Kenneth Arrow, and Anthony Downs all made fundamental contributions to a theory of democracy focusing on the translation of individual preferences into collective choices through voting. While their work gave the populist ideal a much clearer and more definite form than it had previously had, it also revealed unexpected difficulties in the very notion of popular sovereignty, difficulties severe enough to provoke Riker's subsequent rejection of, quote, coercion in the name of temporary or spurious majorities, end quote. The second formidable mid-century challenge to the populist ideal came from sociologists and political scientists harnessing the new technology of survey research to the study of public opinion and electoral politics. Time and time again, they found that the opinions and behavior of ordinary citizens comported poorly with expectations derived from democratic theory as they understood it, that is, from the folk theory. For example, a team from Columbia University conducted path-breaking empirical studies of voting behavior in the 1940 and 1948 presidential elections. Lazarsfeld, Bartels, and Godet, 1948, Bartels, Lazarsfeld, and McPhee, 1954. They produce a long list of contrast between democratic ideals and their own findings regarding voters' motivations, knowledge, and reasoning. Quote, the democratic citizen is expected to be well informed about political affairs, they wrote. He is supposed to know what the issues are, what their history is, what the relevant facts are, what alternatives are proposed, what the party stands for, what the likely consequences are. By such standards, the voter falls short, end quote. As we will show, subsequent research by a great many other scholars has come to very similar conclusions. In the remainder of this chapter, we take up both these challenges to the folk theory of democracy. We begin with the logical challenge, then turn to the empirical challenge. All right, here we go. The spatial model of voting and elections. The most systematic and sophisticated instantiation of the populist ideal is the spatial model of voting and elections. Although the model has been a mainstay of political science for the past half-century, It was originally formulated primarily by economists, perhaps because the intellectual framework of economics meshed naturally with the liberal view that the aim of the democracy is to aggregate individual preferences into a collective choice in as fair and efficient way as possible, as David Miller put it. Miller acknowledged in a footnote that some readers might object to the limited focus on one strand of liberalism, the importance it attaches to individual preferences and their expression. However, he argued that that strand prevails in contemporary liberal societies where democracy is predominantly understood as involving the aggregation of independently formed preferences. Thus, in effect, the goal of the spatial model was to give mathematical form to the folk theory of democracy. In the canonical version of the spatial model, due primarily to Anthony Downes, the political space consists of a single ideological dimension on which feasible policies are arrayed from left to right. Each voter is represented by an ideal point along this dimension, reflecting the policy she prefers to all others. Each party is represented by a platform reflecting the policy it will enact if elected. Voters are assumed to maximize their ideological satisfaction with the election outcome by voting for the parties closest to them on the ideological dimension. Parties are assumed to maximize their expected payoff from office holding by choosing the platforms most likely to get them elected. In the simplest case, where there are just two parties, this framework is sufficient to derive a striking and substantively important prediction. Both parties will adopt identical platforms corresponding to the median of the distribution of voters' ideal points. This so-called median voter theorem is a special case of a more general result regarding collective choice with single-peaked preferences. Since a platform and resulting government policy located at the median of the distribution of voters' ideal points has a smaller average distance from all voters' ideal points than any other feasible policy, the median voter theorem seems to imply that the mere fact of electoral competition will ensure that voters' preferences are as well satisfied in a utilitarian sense as they possibly can be. Thus, the voters enjoy responsive government regardless of which party wins any given election. In addition to being elegant and normatively attractive, these spatial theories seem to provide a compelling explanation for the ideologically muted politics of mid-20th century America. Candidates and parties were moderate and, to a casual observer, largely indistinguishable, apparently due to the natural centripetal tendencies of a smoothly running majoritarian system. And when more extreme candidates emerged on the political scene, Barry Goldwater in 1964, George McGovern in 1972, they were trounced at the polls, just as the theory suggested they should be. By the 1980s, it seemed apparent to many scholars that, quote, the spatial theory of voting provides important insights into real-world voting, and more specifically that, the center of voting opinion exerts a powerful force over election results, in Lowenhinich. Subsequent work has elaborated the canonical spatial model in a variety of important ways. For example, by allowing for probabilistic voting behavior, non-spatial valence factors such as charisma and incumbency, parties motivated by policy as well as office seeking, constraints on parties' platforms, for example due to historical legacies, and uncertainty in voters' perceptions of parties' platforms. For our purposes here, the most important elaboration replaced the unidimensional ideological spectrum with a multidimensional policy space. Reducing all of politics to a single ideological dimension was plainly at odds with empirical evidence suggesting that most citizens in the 1950s had distinct, indeed virtually uncorrelated views about economic, social, and foreign policies. Thus, as Otto Davis, Melvin Hinich, and Peter Ordashuk acknowledged, If spatial models are to retain descriptive and predictive value, they must allow for more than one dimension of conflict and taste. In his critique of Downes's spatial model, Donald Stokes referred to the axiom of unidimensionality as its, quote, most evident and perhaps least fundamental point of unrealism, suggesting that it might well be dispensed with. From a purely technical standpoint, Stokes was right. Within a few years of his writing, the assumption of unidimensionality was dispensed with. Unfortunately, this technical advance turned out to generate considerable conceptual difficulties for a model doing double duty as an empirical theory of electoral politics and a normative theory of populist democracy. One of the most striking virtues of the canonical one-dimensional spatial model is that it identified a unique, normatively attractive, and seemingly feasible solution to the problem of aggregating individual preferences into a democratic policy choice, the policy located at the ideal point of the median voter. However, in their influential expository development of the spatial theory, Davis, Hinich, and Ordashuk noted an important distinction between the unidimensional and multidimensional cases, positions preferred by a majority of voters to every alternative position, in general, do not exist for a multidimensional world. As they observed, the possibility that such a paradox exists poses a problem for majority decision-making. Thus, even if voters' preferences in every issue domain are single-peaked, as the spatial model assumes, there may be no policy platform with a logical claim to represent the will of the majority, much less the will of the people. Davis, Hinich, and Ordashuk described conditions that guarantee the dominance of a single position for any number of dimensions, the symmetry and unimodality of the electorate's preference density in multidimensional space. However, they carefully noted the eminent restrictiveness of these conditions and concluded that one should not presume the existence of dominant positions in multidimensional models. Subsequent analyses along similar lines richly justified that caution by producing a series of so-called chaos theorems demonstrating with increasing mathematical generality that the sufficient conditions are exceedingly fragile. Once the distribution of voters' ideal points deviates from multidimensional symmetry, it is very likely that any feasible policy will be beatable by some other feasible policy in a straight majority vote. This problem for majority decision-making, as Davis, Hinich, and Ordashuk called it, is a manifestation of the paradox of voting, explored by a long line of social choice theorists, including the Marquis de Condorcet in the 18th century and Charles Dodgson, Lewis Carroll, in the 19th century. Kenneth Arrow's much broader general possibility theorem demonstrated that any collective decision-making process satisfying certain reasonable-sounding conditions, not just majority rule, must be subject to similar difficulties. Arrow's theorem demonstrated with mathematical rigor that what many people seem to want, a reliable democratic procedure for aggregating coherent individual preferences to arrive at a coherent collective choice, was simply, logically, unattainable. One commentator, Charles Plot, referred rather melodramatically to Arrow's theorem and related theoretical work as, quote, a gigantic cavern into which fall almost all of our ideas about social actions. Almost anything anyone has ever said about what society wants or should get is threatened with internal inconsistency. It is as though people have been talking for years about a thing that cannot, in principle, exist, and a major effort is needed to see what objectively remains from the conversations. End quote. Of course, Arrow's theorem and the multidimensional spatial model are specific formulations of the problem of collective choice within the narrow framework of the folk theory of democracy, not the sum total of what anyone has ever said about what society wants or should get. Nonetheless, the remarkable fact that the populist ideal turned out to be logically incoherent within this simple, seemingly congenial theoretical framework did spur a major effort to reassess processes of preference aggregation in democratic politics. Subsequent work by political scientists has attempted to specify and explain how specific political institutions shape collective choices in the absence of equilibria of tastes, derivable directly from individual preferences. For example, germaneness rules, committee specialization, and conference procedures in legislatures may simplify policy choices sufficiently to ensure the existence of stable equilibria even in settings where the distribution of preferences alone would leave any outcome potentially susceptible to being overturned through agenda manipulation and multidimensional log rolling. In the realm of electoral politics, Richard Johnston and colleagues acknowledged that the image of the electorate which dominates popular discussion is one of the people as a free-standing body with its own indomitable collective opinion. But in an election, the collective opinion of the people can be expressed only with reference to a very limited menu of alternative party platforms. In effect, a restriction analogous to the institutional rules facilitating the avoidance of disequilibrium in the legislative realm. As E. Schattschneider famously put it, the electorate is, quote, a sovereign whose vocabulary is limited to two words, yes and no, end quote. Thus, Johnston and his colleagues argued for a broader view of the electoral process, encompassing not only how voters choose, but how parties and leaders shape the alternatives from which the choice is made. Empirical scholarship on agenda-setting processes and institutions has been stimulating and fruitful, but it has done little to fill the gaping hole identified by Plot in the normative logic of popular sovereignty. If collective choices depend crucially on how parties and leaders shape the alternatives from which the choice is made, and on the detailed workings of political institutions that are themselves ultimately created by collective choices, in what sense can these choices be said to reflect popular will? The choice of institutional structures is subject to Arrow's theorem too. So far, the spatial modeling tradition has produced no satisfactory solution to this conundrum. Some democratic theorists have attempted to sidestep the logical incoherence revealed by Arrow's theorem by supposing that deliberation rather than formal agenda-setting procedures might reduce complex multidimensional decisions to a single dimension or to a sequence of unidimensional decisions, conveniently satisfying the technical assumptions for the existence of a majoritarian equilibrium. For example, Miller suggested that democratic deliberation might mitigate incoherence by generating widespread consensus about how to locate the various alternatives along a single dimension, or about how to separate the issue into independent unidimensional components. Writing 2 decades later, Jack Knight and James Johnson observed that, quote, it is by now a commonplace among interpreters of social choice theory that political argument might well work precisely to induce just such constraints by allowing relevant constituencies to sort out and hopefully reduce the dimensions over which they disagree, end quote. Christian List and his colleagues used before and after comparisons of opinion from deliberative polls to provide some empirical support for this suggestion. On a variety of issues, participants were somewhat more likely to express single-peaked, unidimensional preferences after participating in deliberation than before. However, whether that should be reassuring would seem to depend crucially on the quality of deliberation leading to the reorganization of opinion, and on how frequently such reorganization actually occurs in more typical political settings. The closest Knight and Johnson came to a concrete example of how deliberation might induce constraints on the dimensionality of collective choice was to suggest that, quote, the parties to some controversy might agree that what is at stake is a matter of national defense rather than, say, facilitating interstate commerce. such as in the argument over the U.S. interstate highway system, end quote. But on what basis might they come to that agreement? And why should we be reassured if they do, since the agreement is patently mistaken? The interstate highway system is clearly a matter of both national defense and interstate commerce. Just as with formal rules for simplifying collective choices, informal agreements, struck in the course of democratic deliberation, may be more or less sensible and broadly accepted. But just as with formal agenda-setting procedures, any particular agreement to divide an inherently multidimensional issue into unidimensional pieces will shape the outcome of a collective choice in some way that is, from a purely populist standpoint, fundamentally arbitrary. Thus, deliberation provides no easy escape from the theoretical challenge posed by Arrow's theorem. Formal theories of collective choice thus turned out to be a mixed blessing for the folk theory of democracy. On one hand, the simple unidimensional spatial model proposed by Downes provided an elegant and largely comforting account of the political significance of electoral competition. As John Zoller put it, quote, "The economic theory of democracy has great curb appeal. The rationally ignorant median voter gets what he wants without much effort," end quote. On the other hand, the multidimensional spatial model and the theory of social choice, more generally, has no curb appeal at all. Even a perfectly rational, highly informed median voter does not get what she wants. That result raised fundamental logical problems for the populist ideal by calling into question how any sort of electoral process could reliably aggregate potentially complex individual preferences into a coherent will of the people. Okay. Well, I think I'm taking a break from this. That's a rough read.